They say history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. That's the comfortable version. The version people use to reassure themselves that the past is simply a guide, not a warning. But what if that's wrong? What if history doesn't rhyme at all? What if it repeats with terrifying precision, only worse each time because the stakes are bigger, the systems are more fragile, and the shocks move faster? What if the world isn't drifting away from the past but circling back to it? Because right now, the world is sleepwalking into a moment that looks uncannily like 1930. Same signals, same patterns. Same economic breakdown, same political atmosphere. Same global power fractures, same public denial. But with one critical difference. This time the collapse won't just be financial. It will be systemic, and the world isn't prepared. Most people think the Great Depression began in 1929, a single moment. A stock market crash, a sudden disaster. But that's not what happened. The real collapse happened in 1930, the year after the crash. That's when the credit system failed. That's when the unemployment surge began. That's when banks started collapsing. That's when trade froze. That's when governments panicked. The crash was the spark. 1930 was the fire. And here's the part nobody wants to confront. 2026 isn't 1929. It's 1930. The crash already happened. The damage is already in motion. The unraveling has already begun. Most people just haven't felt it yet. The signs are identical. An everything bubble inflated by years of easy money and artificial stability. Record global debt. Asset prices disconnected from reality. A financial system held together by confidence alone. Political polarization tearing nations apart from within. Global trade fracturing. Rising economic nationalism. Currency instability. And a world convinced that somehow this time will be different. Because every generation believes the same lie right up until the moment reality arrives. Look at the setup. Before 1929, the world experienced nearly a decade of explosive growth fueled by cheap credit. Stocks soared, real estate boomed. Consumers spent money they didn't have. Politicians celebrated prosperity as permanent. Economists declared a new era of stability. Sound familiar? From 2009 to 2021, the world experienced the longest bull market in history. Central banks printed more money than in all previous centuries combined. Interest rates dropped to the lowest levels in 5,000 years. The U.S. government added trillions in debt without consequence. Asset prices exploded. Tech valuations went to the moon. Housing became unaffordable for an entire generation. And everyone convinced themselves that as long as the Federal Reserve printed enough money, nothing could go wrong. Then came the shock. In 1929, the stock market finally cracked. In 2020, the global system cracked first with COVID, then with inflation, then with interest rate shock. The world didn't recognize it because the timeline was different. In 1929, the crash was visible. In the modern era, the crash was delayed. Because central banks intervened. They printed. They bailed out. They backstopped. They stabilized markets artificially. They pushed the consequences forward instead of letting the system reset. The result? The world is entering its 1930 moment only, with far more leverage, far more fragility, and far fewer escape routes. Start with the first parallel. Debt. In 1930, global debt reached unprecedented levels. Governments, businesses, and consumers had borrowed aggressively during the boom. When the bubble burst, the debt became unpayable. Today, the world is drowning in more than $307 trillion in global debt, 4 times larger relative to the economy than in 1930. Countries are borrowing, just to pay interest on previous borrowing. The U.S. alone is adding $1 trillion in debt every 100 days. Interest costs are exploding. In 1930, rising interest rates suffocated the economy. In 2026, even if interest rates fall, the debt burden remains fatal because the scale is mathematically impossible to repay. The second parallel, banking fragility. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 9,000 U.S. banks failed. Not because they were poorly run, but because the financial system was built on confidence, not liquidity. As soon as people lost trust, the system collapsed. Today, banks are more interconnected, more leveraged, and more dependent on asset prices remaining high. In 2023 and 2024, the world got its first preview. Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in 48 hours. Credit Suisse, one of the most systemically important banks in Europe, failed overnight and had to be force-fed into UBS to avoid a global crisis. That wasn't a crisis. That was the warning shot. In 1930, the failures began slowly, then accelerated. In 2026, the same pattern is emerging, only faster due to digital withdrawals, social media panic cycles, and real-time liquidity drainage. What used to take months now takes hours. The third parallel, inflation flipping into deflation. In the late 1920s, prices were rising, wages were climbing. Consumers felt wealthy, but after the crash everything reversed. Demand collapsed, prices plunged. Deflation destroyed the economy, not inflation. Today, everyone is terrified of inflation. But the real danger comes after inflation, when tightening kills growth, credit freezes, and demand disappears. That's when the real damage begins. Inflation is a symptom. Deflation is the executioner. And 2026 is positioned for the same shift. The world thinks falling prices will be relief. But falling prices during high-debt environments don't create recovery. They create collapse. The fourth parallel, global trade breakdown. After 1929, countries responded to economic stress by turning inward. The U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, triggering a cascade of retaliation. Global trade fell by 66%. Economies imploded not because supply disappeared, but because trust disappeared. Today, the world is witnessing the same fracture. U.S. versus China. Russia versus the West. Sanctions weaponized. Supply chains regionalized. BRICS forming alternative currency systems. Countries hoarding resources instead of exporting them. Nations are deglobalizing not gradually, but structurally. And global trade is already shrinking for the first time in decades. In 1930, the world thought protectionism would help. It accelerated collapse. In 2026, the world is repeating the same mistake, only at a scale the 1930s could never imagine. The fifth parallel, political polarization. In the 1930s, societies fractured under economic stress. Extremism rose, governments lost legitimacy, public trust collapsed. Social stability evaporated. Today, the same forces are converging worldwide. The U.S. is more politically divided than at any time since the Civil War. Europe is fractured by immigration, nationalism, and economic inequality. China is facing internal pressure beneath the surface. Countries across Latin America are swinging between radical political extremes. Democracies are gridlocked. Authoritarian systems are tightening control. And just like the 1930s, the political system is incapable of solving the economic system. But this time, the stakes are exponentially higher. Because in 1930, the world wasn't globalized. Supply chains were local. Financial systems were isolated. Countries could collapse independently. Today, the world is interconnected. One nation's crisis becomes every nation's crisis instantly. In 1930, a banking collapse took months to spread. Today, it would spread in seconds. In 1930, people lined up outside banks. In 2026, withdrawals happen digitally at the speed of panic. In 1930, news spread slowly. Today, misinformation spreads globally in minutes, fueling systemic shocks before governments can react. And here's the most dangerous part. In 1930, central banks had limited power, their tools were weak, their balance sheets were small. In 2026, central banks are the system. They are the lenders, the buyers, the stabilizers, the liquidity providers, the market makers, and in many cases, the only force preventing collapse. But the power that saved the world after 2008 is the same power that now traps it. Central banks have no bullets left. Interest rates are already at levels that strain governments and risk defaults. Printing money causes inflation. Cutting rates fuels asset bubbles. Tightening collapses credit. Loosening collapses currencies. Every option triggers a crisis somewhere. The world has reached the point where central banks can no longer fix the problem because central banks are the problem. The system is built on perpetual debt expansion. But debt expansion is mathematically finished. The US can't borrow indefinitely. Europe can't sustain negative growth with rising rates. Japan can't survive a yield spike without triggering bankruptcy. China can't deleverage without triggering mass unemployment. Every major economy is trapped. And 2026 is the breaking point not because of one event, but because of converging structural failures. Just like 1930, the shift happens slowly at first and then all at once. First comes the credit squeeze, then comes the liquidity freeze, then comes the asset repricing, then comes the unemployment spike, then comes the political response, and finally, the loss of confidence that turns an economic slowdown into a global depression. The world is currently in phase 2. The liquidity tightening has already begun. Banks are restricting lending. Corporations are refinancing at higher rates. Consumers are maxed out. Governments are issuing more debt than the market can absorb. And central banks are stuck between inflation and insolvency. But here's what makes 2026 worse than 1930. The global financial system is now built on derivatives contracts tied to the value of assets that assume stability. The notional value of these derivatives exceeds $600 trillion. In 1930, markets crashed. Today, the collapse would trigger a chain reaction across every financial institution on Earth. In 1930, unemployment destroyed households. Today, automation replaces them permanently. In 1930, governments couldn't coordinate. Today, governments don't trust each other enough to coordinate. In 1930, currencies were tied to gold. Today, currencies are backed by debt and the trust that debt will always be repaid. If trust breaks, the currency breaks. And when the currency breaks, everything breaks. Most people believe a soft landing is coming. That inflation will fall, growth will recover, and the system will reset peacefully. The same belief existed in 1930. Newspapers printed optimistic forecasts. Politicians promised stability. Economists insisted recovery was months away. And then the real collapse began, because the bottom doesn't happen when the market falls. The bottom happens when confidence falls. And confidence is already cracking, quietly, slowly, beneath the surface. Corporate defaults are rising. Commercial real estate is collapsing. Banks are absorbing unrealized losses they can't survive if rates stay high. Consumers are burning through savings at the fastest pace since the 1930s. Governments are pretending nothing is wrong because admitting the problem would trigger the collapse they fear. That's exactly what happened in 1930, but here's the twist no one is talking about. In 1930, the United States was rising. Today, the United States is struggling under structural burdens. In 1930, debt was low. Today, debt is existential. In 1930, the dollar was not yet the global reserve currency. Today, it is, and the entire world depends on it. In 1930, globalization didn't exist. Today, every supply chain, every currency, every banking system, every government, and every market is tied together. That means when 2026 hits, the world won't experience a regional depression. It will experience a synchronized global contraction. And the most dangerous assumption people make is believing the worst has already passed. That the pandemic was the shock. That inflation was the peak. That higher rates are temporary. That the system will normalize, but normalization requires stability. And stability requires trust, and trust is evaporating. Not slowly, rapidly, the same way it evaporated in 1930 right before the world realized the crash wasn't an event. It was a beginning. This is where the story turns. Because the question isn't whether 2026 looks like 1930. It's why 2026 will be worse. Not because history repeats automatically, but because every structural weakness the world had in 1930 is amplified today. The debt is bigger. The leverage is higher. The financial system is more fragile. Governments are more divided. Central banks are more constrained. Global tensions are more explosive. And the tools used to postpone collapse have now made collapse inevitable. So let us go deeper into the mechanics of why the world is heading toward a 1930-style collapse in 2026, and why this time there is no safety net underneath. Because in 1930, the collapse happened inside a world that still had buffers. Today, every buffer is already gone. Start with the foundation of the global financial system, the currency structure. In 1930, the world was tied to gold. It limited government spending, restricted money creation, and forced countries to face consequences when they mismanaged their economies. Painful? Yes, but it also prevented total collapse. Today, the world is tied to nothing. For the first time in history, every major currency is backed not by gold, not by productivity, but by debt. The US dollar isn't a store of value. It's a claim on future tax revenue that may never arrive. The euro isn't a currency. It's a political experiment held together by compromise. The yen isn't stability, it's a pressure cooker built on impossible mathematics. And China's yuan isn't a challenger. It's a controlled currency inside a fragile economic system. In 1930, currencies collapsed because governments couldn't print enough money. In 2026, currencies will collapse because governments printed too much. The world crossed the point of no return in 2020, when central banks printed $30 trillion to stop the pandemic collapse. They didn't rescue the system. They destroyed the stability of money itself. Inflation wasn't the problem, it was the symptom. The real problem is that the world now requires permanent money printing just to avoid collapse. The moment liquidity stops, the system starts breaking. Which means every country is trapped. Print too much, currency collapse. Print too little, credit collapse. Raise rates, debt collapse. Cut rates, inflation spike. Every path leads to crisis. Now combine that with the second factor, global power realignment. In the 1930s, the world entered a geopolitical transition. Britain was declining. The United States was rising. Germany and Japan were challenging the global order. No one could imagine what came next until it was too late. Today, the world is replaying the same script, only at global scale. The United States is no longer unchallenged. China is rising economically but weakening internally. Russia is declining militarily but destabilizing externally. Europe is fragmenting politically. The Middle East is shifting its alliances. BRICS nations are building parallel financial systems. The world is no longer unipolar. It's not yet multipolar. It's unstable. And unstable power structures don't transition peacefully. People assume history teaches lessons. It doesn't. History shows patterns. And the pattern is always the same. Economic crisis leads to political extremism, which leads to geopolitical conflict. In the 1930s, nations responded to crisis with nationalism, rearmament, territorial expansion, and economic warfare. In the 2020s, nations are doing the same, only with more dangerous tools. Trade war between the US and China. Technology war over semiconductors. Currency war through de-dollarization. Resource war over energy and minerals. Cyber warfare, information warfare, proxy conflicts. And here's the critical difference. The next global conflict won't start with armies. It will start with financial systems failing. Because the real battlefield of 2026 isn't land or sea, it's money. Whoever controls currency controls trade. Whoever controls trade controls supply chains. Whoever controls supply chains controls nations. In 1930, the world didn't understand this. In 2026, every major power does. That's why nations are hoarding gold. That's why China is dumping treasuries slowly. That's why the US froze the reserves of Russia. That's why BRICS is building alternative settlement systems. That's why Saudi Arabia is questioning the petrodollar. These aren't random events. They are pre-crisis realignments, the exact same thing the world saw in the late 1920s, only bigger and faster. But the geopolitical fracture isn't the final trigger. The real trigger is the social collapse that follows economic breakdown. In 1930, unemployment hit 25%. Breadlines formed. Crime surged. Governments lost credibility. The social fabric tore apart. And that was in a world without social media, without instant communication, without the ability for panic to spread at digital speed. Today, societies are already on edge. Before the real economic crisis begins, people can't afford housing. Young generations are priced out of the future. Wages can't keep up with inflation. Trust in institutions is collapsing. Every election becomes a referendum on fear. Every disagreement becomes a civil war of narratives. And governments are losing legitimacy before the downturn even arrives. Now imagine what happens when the downturn does arrive. When unemployment spikes, when small businesses collapse, when governments are forced to cut spending, when pensions come under pressure, when taxes rise aggressively, when inflation returns at the worst possible moment, when social support systems break under the weight of reality. The 1930s only had economic hardship. The 2020s have economic hardship plus political extremism, plus cultural fragmentation, plus digital amplification. That combination has no historical precedent, and no country is prepared for it. But the most underestimated factor, the one historians will one day point to, is the technological acceleration of collapse. In 1930, economic breakdown created unemployment. Then labor markets eventually recovered. Today, unemployment created by recession will collide with automation. Jobs won't just disappear temporarily. They will disappear permanently. Artificial intelligence isn't replacing workers in the future. It's replacing them now, right as the economic cycle turns downward. In 1930, a destroyed job eventually came back. In 2026, a destroyed job won't. That means the social consequences of economic collapse will last longer, run deeper, and recover slower than anything in the past century. And yet the most dangerous belief remains the same, that governments will save the system. People think central banks will print money forever. They think governments can run infinite deficits. They think the financial system will adjust smoothly. They think modern tools make collapse impossible. That is exactly what the world believed in 1929. Then, 1930 arrived. Governments tried everything: rate cuts, spending programs, currency interventions, and the situation got worse. Not because the policies were weak, but because the system itself was broken. The same is true today. The problem is not policy. The problem is structure. Every major economy now depends on debt to function. Companies issue debt to buy back stock. Consumers borrow to maintain living standards. Governments borrow to avoid political consequences. Banks borrow short to lend long. The entire system requires constant expansion, and expansion is over. That's why 2026 is not the crisis itself. It's the recognition of the crisis. The moment the world realizes the growth model is dead. The moment the consequences of the past 15 years finally arrive. The moment the delay ends. But here's the question no one is asking: what replaces the system after it breaks? In 1930, the collapse reset global finance. Gold was abandoned. New institutions were built. The US dollar became the global anchor. The world reconstructed itself around a new monetary order. In 2026, the collapse won't be a reset. It will be a transition. But into what? The dollar cannot remain dominant forever. The yuan cannot replace it. The euro cannot survive fragmentation. A global digital currency is politically impossible. Gold cannot scale to modern trade. Bitcoin cannot stabilize global lending. That means the next monetary system does not exist yet. And history shows the world does not build new systems peacefully. It builds them through crisis. The Great Depression gave birth to Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods collapsed and gave birth to the petrodollar. The petrodollar system is now breaking, and the world has no successor ready. That is why 2026 is more dangerous than 1930. The world is approaching systemic failure without a replacement architecture. When the current order breaks, there will be a window, a brief period when global power is decided not by stability, but by survival. And that brings us to the final phase, the one nobody wants to acknowledge. In 1930, the collapse took years. Today it can happen in months. Not because markets are weaker, but because information moves faster than governments can respond. In 1930, fear spread through newspapers. In 2026, fear spreads through millions of screens simultaneously. In 1930, bank runs required physical lines. In 2026, bank runs are digital and instantaneous. In 1930, governments could close banks and stop withdrawals. In 2026, capital moves globally with a tap. No institution can freeze panic at the speed panic now travels. This is why the world is closer to systemic failure than anyone realizes. Not because collapse is inevitable, but because prevention is impossible. The system is too interconnected to unwind, too indebted to sustain, too fragile to tighten, too inflation-sensitive to loosen, and too politically divided to coordinate. And the most ironic part? The world still thinks the danger is in the future. Just like 1930, nobody realized the depression had already begun, not when the crash happened, not when unemployment rose, not when banks failed. Only later, when it was too late to stop the chain reaction already underway. The same illusion exists now. People think the worst is behind us. They are wrong. The worst is ahead because the structural breaking point has not yet been felt at the surface. It is building quietly beneath the noise of headlines, beneath political distractions, beneath temporary market rallies, beneath the illusion of normalcy. Collapse doesn't start with panic. Collapse starts with confidence, and confidence is already gone. The world just hasn't accepted it yet. So here's the real question. What do you do when history repeats, but the outcome is worse? In 1930, survival required understanding the system before it broke. In 2026, the same is true, but the timeline is shorter, because when the breaking point comes, it will not come slowly. It will not give warnings, it will not allow time to react. It will happen the way all modern crises now happen, suddenly, violently, and globally. If this changed how you see the future, then you finally seeing what most people can't see, that we are not heading toward a crisis, we are already inside one. And the next phase has not yet begun. But when it does, the world will divide into two groups: those who are trapped in the old system and those who saw the break before it arrived. But here's the part almost nobody understands, and it's the reason 2026 won't just echo 1930, it will surpass it. Because every financial crisis in history has been triggered by one of three forces: a credit collapse, a currency collapse, or a confidence collapse. The Great Depression was the first. It began as a credit collapse. The 1970s were the second. It was a currency collapse after the dollar was detached from gold. But the next collapse won't be one of these forces. It will be all three converging at the same time. Credit is already cracking, currency stability is already fading, confidence is already evaporating. And once these forces align, no country on earth will be able to contain the consequences. Not the United States, not China, not the IMF, not the G20. When confidence goes, control goes with it. In 1930, governments still had the ability to rebuild trust. Today they don't, because governments aren't seen as credible institutions anymore, they are seen as factions. The United States can't pass legislation without gridlock. Europe can't unify policy without breaking internally. China can't stimulate growth without triggering capital flight. Japan can't raise interest rates without detonating its debt. Every major economy is boxed in. Every government is cornered. Every tool creates a counter-crisis somewhere else. And the public no longer believes in leadership. It believes in survival. That's the shift historians always miss. Crises don't begin when systems fail. They begin when people stop believing systems can be saved. In 1930, that loss of faith took years. In 2026, it will take days. Maybe hours. Because the world now lives inside a real-time feedback loop. Fear is no longer local, it is global and instantaneous. A bank failure in California triggers a liquidity shock in Singapore. A debt auction failure in Washington rattles bond markets in Europe. A currency swing in Japan destabilizes emerging markets overnight. The world doesn't have time anymore. The system moves faster than the people trying to control it. And that is why the belief that governments will step in is nothing more than psychological comfort. Step in with what? The United States is already running $2 trillion annual deficits during peacetime economic expansion. What happens when the recession begins? What happens when tax revenues fall? What happens when interest costs exceed defense spending? Printing money will trigger another inflation surge. Not printing will trigger another credit freeze. There is no version of the future where the United States exits cleanly. The same is true for Europe. The euro survived the last decade only through artificial support, but artificial systems eventually hit reality. You cannot have a single currency without a single fiscal union. You cannot have a single monetary policy with 20 economies moving in opposite directions. The next downturn won't weaken the euro. It will test its existence. Japan is in an even more impossible position. It has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in modern history. It printed money for 30 years. It held interest rates near zero for an entire generation. When it finally raises rates to stop inflation, the entire system will break. Not gradually, instantly. A 1% increase in yields could collapse the Japanese bond market. And if Japan falls, global markets fall with it because Japan is the world's largest source of foreign capital. But the most fragile player is China. In 1930, the United States was industrializing and rising. Today, China is slowing and heavily leveraged. Its real estate sector, the backbone of its economy, is collapsing. Local governments are drowning in hidden debt. Youth unemployment is at crisis levels. And the social contract that kept China stable is under pressure. Prosperity in exchange for obedience. When prosperity slows, obedience becomes unstable. This is why 2026 is not just an economic turning point, it is a geopolitical trigger point. History shows that global power transitions never happen during stability. They happen during collapse. The British Empire did not decline during peace and prosperity. It declined after World War I and collapsed after World War II. The Soviet Union did not fall during stability. It fell after financial exhaustion. The United States will not lose dominance because another nation outperforms it. It will lose dominance if the system it leads collapses underneath it. That's what makes the modern moment so dangerous. The global financial order is weakening at the same time global power is shifting. There is no anchor, no stabilizer, no fallback structure. The institutions that held the world together, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, NATO G7, were built for a world that no longer exists. They cannot manage a breakdown of the system itself. So what comes next? In every historical collapse, 3 stages unfold. First, denial, when people believe the crisis is temporary. Second, recognition, when they realize the system isn't recovering. Third, replacement, when a new order emerges. The world today is still in stage 1. The transition to stage 2 will happen in 2026. But stage 3 is where history becomes dangerous, because transitions are never smooth. In 1930, replacement came through global war. In 2026, replacement may come through financial fragmentation, separate currency blocks, regional trade systems, parallel payment networks, and competing economic zones. The global economy won't collapse into nothing. It will break into pieces. The dollar zone, the UN zone, the Eurozone, the commodities zone. Each functioning separately, not collectively. That shift won't feel like a single dramatic moment. It will feel like a slow-motion break, until one day, the world wakes up and realizes the old system is gone. And that is why understanding the pattern matters. Not to predict collapse, but to recognize it while others are still denying it. Because the people who survived 1930 were not the ones waiting for the world to return to normal. They were the ones who understood that normal was already gone. The same is true now. Most people are preparing for a recovery. They should be preparing for a transition. Not the end of the world, the end of the system that built it.